Okay, I think we'll get our webinar underway. Happy first day of the month and welcome to Integrity360 and XM Cyber's webinar on CTEM, Mastering Exposure Management. I'm joined today, so myself, Richard Ford, was a Chief Technology Officer for Integrity360, but I'm joined today by the excellent Matt Quinn from XM Cyber, one of our key partners in addressing the challenge around exposure management. So what are we going to run through today? I'll just touch upon the agenda. We're just going to talk about exposure versus vulnerability and dive down into that question. We're going to have a look at the changing exposure landscape and why we need to look at how we evolve or enhance our approach. And then we're going to touch into the main content, really, which is around the Gartner CTEM approach, and then how we can adopt it using XM Cyber. And then we'll wrap up with a QA session. So as I say, really, I'm jointly hosting this with Matt. I'd probably say that I'll be the host and he's the brains and the beauty behind the majority of what we're going to get through. So I will do my introduction, hand over to Matt, and then we can dive into the piece around XM Cyber and how that can really help you evolve your exposure management approach. So I'd like to start first and taking some inspiration from one of my colleagues in one of his presentations to look at a definition for exposure. And looking at exposure, this is taken from the University of Cambridge dictionary as a noun for harmful condition. So really a situation or condition that makes something likely to be harmed, especially because that person or item has not been protected from something dangerous, which, in other words, really is a vulnerability. So there's probably a question there. Exposure management is the hot topic in the industry at the moment that we're seeing a lot of vendors talking about, a lot of analysts talking about, and we're going to come on to that a little bit later. But one of the things I think we need to think about is exposure management, the new exciting and impactful solution, or is it that magic bullet, or is it the emperor's new clothing? I think that's what we're going to dive into a little bit today and try and answer that question and differentiate between the two and how they impact each other. So talking about vulnerabilities, vulnerability management in isolation is definitely not something that's going to go away. Something we've seen, and just actually looking at the graph tracking the National Vulnerability Database and the number of CVEs, we're seeing huge growth and actually 25% year-on-year growth between 2021 and 2022. And once we get to the end of the year and we look back at 2023, we expect that growth to continue. And so we have a continuously growing number of vulnerabilities being identified in our environments that need to be addressed, creating a continuous problem and challenge of how do we keep on top of these? How do we make sure that we're resolving vulnerabilities on a continuous process to make sure that we're not exposed? A lot of organizations will have a traditional approach to exposure that really does center around vulnerability management. At best, we'll be in a nice process of discovery, organize, assess, report, remediate, and then verify. But some of the challenges really is how limited in scope our vulnerability management processes are and continue to be, that aren't addressing what we need to be concerned about today. So we have a focus on vulnerabilities, and we'll touch upon that in a second, but a focus on traditional assets, so covering endpoints, servers, network devices, and being very periodic in scanning with no real-time view, and having very much limited prioritization, making it very difficult for us to be able to tackle that challenge of an ever-growing number of vulnerabilities. And if we clash that with the changes in the IT landscape that we've seen, we can see how this problem does grow and how we need to look at how we cover these challenges. So very much going from that traditional perimeter-based view of our landscape where everything was contained within our data centers with traditional applications, which is really where most of our vulnerability management and exposure management practices have been born out of, using network scanners to be able to identify where our vulnerabilities are and looking at those in those traditional applications and locations. Whereas actually the reality of today and where we've rapidly got to over the last 3 to 5 years is a very different environment where actually the majority of our workloads, 70% of our applications plus are in SaaS-based environments. Our workloads have been moved into the public cloud, whether they're serverless functions or VMs or Kubernetes containers. But we'll still have that on-prem challenge on our our users and our workers are all now hybrid and remote. So how do we keep, maintain visibility of their vulnerabilities in this changing landscape? So I think we need to start thinking about very much changes. We need to start thinking about our DevOps pipelines. We need to think about how we're understanding exposure in our infrastructure as code. We even just start thinking further into the development pipeline and thinking about, well, actually, if we're moving to a cloud function with containers and immutable web services, then we think about actually how we're discovering and managing those vulnerabilities further into the software development lifecycle. And that really does change our view of exposure. So exposure definitely extends well beyond vulnerabilities, which is where many organizations are focused at the moment. And we just start thinking about actually how we're affected by our identities, how we also need to be concerned about our vulnerabilities, but also misconfigurations. Our security posture, particularly of our cloud environments. Gartner considers that 99% of all cloud breaches will have a root cause in misconfiguration. So we need to make sure that we're considering that as part of our exposure, but also the effectiveness of our security controls needs to fit into that, because if our security controls aren't functioning, then that is an element of exposure for ourselves. And that's not to mention other areas like lead credentials, poor physical security, SaaS app misuse, and others. Now, thankfully, the tech sector and the security sector is focused on that. And we can see that from, if we look at Gartner's hype cycle for security operations for last year, we can see that actually the vast majority of emerging technologies, the effort that's being put in by vendors to develop these areas that are being rapidly adopted by organizations, is all based around better management of exposure, whether it's vulnerability prioritization, digital risk protection, testing for exposures, but also attack surface management as well. So this brings us on to the real topic for today, which is really around how do we build in an effective threat exposure management program. And if we look at just a few quotes from Gartner's CTEM framework, we can see that actually even taking a risk-based vulnerability management approach, which should definitely be a starting point, but is not potentially going to be sufficient, is not going to allow us to fix every known vulnerability, because it's always been operationally infeasible. And actually, we need to evolve our approach to be more of a continuous threat exposure management program that really takes an attacker's view of the world and moves well beyond those traditional CVEs. And if we pull that all together, we see that actually that's where the big disconnect is happening between security and IT. And the result is that nobody's winning, and we end up with unnecessary business risk, where the security teams are looking, even when we're expanding out our view of exposure, we can see that actually the challenge is that we're finding more and more exposure, and actually the frustration and the friction ends up with our IT teams unable to deal with that ever-growing list that's being pushed to them from security. And where it's leaving us is that we can't secure our businesses because we're moving at pace and we're expanding our environments rapidly from all areas of the business. And we've ended up with a highly inefficient and unscalable model, and the problem is definitely getting worse. And that's really where the CTEM framework comes into its own, where we're getting our drivers from the cyber risk management, which is really, and I'll just walk through the approach that we need to move to, taking that 5-step process, making exposure management manageable and achievable again. And really what we need to focus on is how, in making that achievable, is how do we define our scope? What is it we need to be looking at and looking for? So making sure that we have a view of exactly what our attack landscape or our attack surface is, so that we can apply the right controls to that. We need to make sure that we're discovering vulnerabilities across the entire IT landscape, not focused just on our traditional assets, but moving into posture and into, as I say, our DevOps processes. And then once we have that discovery, that understanding and discovery, we need to make sure that we're prioritizing. That needs to enrich our threat detection and response capability, but prioritizing what's important, and also prioritizing in a way that isn't just the severity of a CVE, but prioritizing on the accessibility, the exploitability, and the impact that's going to have. And then we also need to validate that that's important. And the reason why the CTEM program has that validation step afterwards is because we want to try and build a program where we're responding to the exposures that really matter, and then and the ones that we've validated that are going to affect us as an organization, so that we can make that achievable. And then the last step there is mobilization, which is where we need to be able to engage our IT teams without flooding them with information and flooding them with activities that they need to carry out to make it achievable for them to respond to that exposure and mitigate that threat. So that's just a highlight and a high-level introduction to the CTEM framework. So as I said, I'm going to step out of the way and hand over to our good partner, Matt, who's going to walk through exactly how XM Cyber can enable organizations to rapidly accelerate their move from a traditional vulnerability management approach to a wider CTEM and exposure management approach, covering the wider IT environment. So Matt, over to you.
Richard, thanks so much for the introduction there. Really appreciate it. Yeah, we were just catching up just before I joined. I had a day out with my daughter at Legoland yesterday, and this presentation is a welcome distraction from that chaos that was Legoland yesterday. So thanks very much, Rich. Yeah, Richard, you touched on this idea of the attacker's eye view. You know, Gartner kind of looks at that. We only typically have an attacker's view when we do those periodic pen tests, or maybe we're even in a position where we're doing kind of red team activities, but we're not doing that enough, and we're not really scaling it. And attackers are looking at our environments with the view of attack paths. Now, how do these exposures actually connect together? We've got lots of exposures around the environment, but how are they connected? And certainly, attackers will use things like vulnerabilities. You know, they will use CVEs either as the, you know, initial sort of lateral movement point, or maybe later on in the process. But typically, you know, we've only been looking at CVEs. There are a much wider set of things that the attacker is doing. They're often taking advantage of vulnerabilities. They're stealing credentials, you know, on users' devices. You know, whenever an admin does an RDP session to another system, in order, you know, to do some administration, they are leaving cached domain credentials behind on different devices, and an attacker is taking advantage of these things. Credential problems are a big issue, and we don't really know where they are, those issues, and that often links into Active Directory problems as well. You know, taking advantage of Active Directory is a very important and powerful step that the attacker can take. In fact, in many cases, they may not even use a CVE at all in order to reach their goals. And as you can see from here, the attacker is moving from one network location to another. So we have a lack of network segmentation as well. You know, we're actually giving the attacker quite open networks to be able to move through the environment. They're also taking advantage of, you know, real user behavior as it happens. You know, we have this concept of dwell time with attackers. They're waiting for certain conditions and certain things to happen. And so we need to understand what those conditions are. What are those user activities that are happening? Now, this step here, moving from the data center to cloud, this is where we also see that kind of big disconnect that Richard talked about. You know, we often have cloud teams, and this is an AWS example, but you think about all the three major clouds typically. We often have an AWS team. Most of our customers, XM Cyber customers, have probably two clouds typically, AWS and Azure being the top two, a number of having GCP as well. But we'll often have a dedicated AWS team, a dedicated Azure team. We've got a dedicated on-prem team. They're not really always working together. In the eyes of the attacker, though, there are lots of paths that can lead the attacker from the on-prem to the cloud. So if we just take, you know, this example here, we can still access keys, or the attacker can still access keys from users that are accessing those systems. If you are using Microsoft Azure, for example, common configuration for XM Cyber customers is that you've got Azure AD Connect, or Entra ID Connect, maybe as they like to call it now, synchronizing your domain information with your Azure environment and vice versa. That system that's on premise is a very important gateway into the cloud. and is treated nearly as important as a domain controller itself. Yet when we've got a cloud-only strategy, we're not really ever looking at the link between the on-prem and the cloud. And certainly, as Richard highlighted, when an attacker is in the cloud, it's those misconfigurations. It's the same kind of problems that we have in Active Directory, actually, typically. You know, too many users, too many groups, too many resources, lots of, too much privilege between these different resources. And that eventually leads the attacker to their goal. This is your critical asset. These are the things that you need to protect. This is your customer data, your most important applications, your OT systems, whatever it might be. This is success for the attacker. And this is what XM Cyber is actually going to show you. We're actually going to show you what are these attack paths. Now, the key thing is that this is just one entry point for the attacker. There's been lots of different attackers that might find their way in and might come in via lots of other directions or methods. So we need to look at things from an attack graph perspective, actually looking at all of the possible paths that exist in an organization. And this is what XM Cyber does on a 24/7 basis without any impact to your environment. We run continuous attack simulations to show you where all these exposures are and how they are connected together as part of attack paths that lead to your most critical systems. Now, as we start to think with the eye of attack graphs, we can make very, very good decisions about this data. And this kind of links us into, the understanding of prioritization, which is a key part of the CTEM process. So we can see all of these attack paths. We now understand that there's actually some exposures that when you're looking at them through the eye of the attacker don't lead anywhere. There's no onward opportunity from this high severity vulnerability. This could be a Log4j instance. Everyone else is going and fixing that straight away because there's this perception that it creates a lot of risk. But in your environment, with all the network segmentation and all of those things, there's actually no onward opportunity to compromise critical assets. So we can deprioritize a number of things that actually don't make sense to fix, at least not today. There are still lots of other problems in the environment, but again, by thinking about this with the eye of the attacker, we can now make better decisions. These two that have been highlighted here are what we refer to as choke points. So these are the objects or users or machines, cloud entities, whatever it might be, that lead to the most amount of compromise of critical systems. If we fix these with a priority, and XM Cyber will actually prioritize these and show you exactly how to fix these issues. If we prioritize these and remove these, we reduce the largest amount of risk to our critical systems with the least amount of effort. And this is really the remediation efficiency that we want to achieve. And this is measurable as well. Now, just touching on something that Richard was mentioning there, this is the way we've been looking at CVEs typically, right? We've only really been focused on CVEs in the exposure stack. And we're doing that vulnerability assessment. We're using some risk-based vulnerability management. But that's, again, as Richard highlighted, it's not enough. There are all of these other issues that need to be taken into consideration because the attacker is going to use many of these in conjunction with vulnerabilities, or maybe even miss CVEs altogether and just leverage these. So we actually have a wider set of exposures that we need to look at. But we're not, looking at it from the attacker's perspective. If we start to look at it from the attacker's perspective, the exploitability of these exposures, the reachability, can the attacker actually move between different locations or different cloud entities, for example? This is really allowing us to reduce the amount of things that we need to focus on. If we start to build that attack graph, as you can see, and we start to understand what are the things that are on paths to critical assets, we can have a massive reduction in the amount of things that we need to prioritize. And this is great for that, the IT teams that actually need to fix these things because there's less for them to do, but yet they're actually reducing risk more. But we can go even further by actually looking at those choke points. not just every attack path that's successful, but those 1 or 2 places that can actually create the largest amount of risk. Again, we get a much larger amount of efficiency. So I'm going to stop talking for a second. Well, actually, no, that's a lie. I am going to keep talking, but I'm also going to do a demonstration as well. I want you to see what our customers see. So I'm actually going to move to the demo portal. Rich, if you can just give me a thumbs up to let me know you can see that. Perfect. A very strong thumbs up from Rich there. This is what we call the battleground in the XM Cyber portal. So what XM Cyber does is you actually give you a visualization to your environment. So this could be made up of on-premise and multiple clouds. Without actually even doing anything, this is very, very powerful to our customers, because our customers are starting to understand already how things are connected together. We use a small piece of software we call a sensor. It runs at about 0.02% CPU, and it gathers information from your endpoint devices and sends that back securely to our cloud in conjunction with read-only information we get from GCP, AWS, and Azure to connect and understand all these exposures and understand how they're all connected together. And this is happening on a continuous basis. There's no impact to your environment. We have customers from wide-ranging verticals such as finance, retail, manufacturing. Some of the biggest organizations out there are using XM Cyber in this way. Now, what we're really concerned about, what we want to understand, is, are there any attack paths to this system up here? This is our critical asset. XM Cyber can actually help you determine what is critical from an attacker's perspective automatically. So if you've not gone through the process of understanding what's critical, XM Cyber can do that for you. But if you've gone through that process and you understand some of the systems that are most critical to you, you can also add that information to XM Cyber, and we'll show you. So I'm going to play through this simulation. This is a very kind of sneak peek to the platform. This is happening on a 24/7 basis, running in the background, showing you where these attack paths are. And this is, our entry point, where the attacker is logically likely to start. We call that the breach point. Where is the attacker likely to land in the environment? Because we know attackers are bypassing, many of our mitigating controls or compensating controls, EDRs, firewalls, email filters. We know attackers are able to bypass those systems. You can see here that the attacker is enumerating the environment, so running reconnaissance. So the things that are turning in blue are systems that the attacker, or resources that the attacker is learning about. And that's important. We can only attack things that we can learn about. There are other systems that are in gray where attacker cannot learn that they exist. So if there's loads of exposures on systems, but from an attacker's perspective, the attacker can never find them, should we really prioritize those? No. We can actually push those down the line and we can start to look at other things. What you can see here is that a lot of systems are in red. This is our attacker compromising these using all of these different types of exposures, the Active Directory problems, the credential issues, the vulnerabilities, the OS and software misconfigurations, the cloud misconfigurations, the user behavior, and the lack of network segmentation, all of these things coming together. Now, again, we talked about, we can't fix all these things. Gartner talks about, it's not feasible. But if we look at things from the attacker's perspective, how did the attacker get to the critical asset? We can now do a much better job at prioritization. So here, this first step is actually a common opportunity for an attacker when using ransomware, taking advantage of a misconfiguration with local admin credentials where the same username and password is used across lots of different systems. This is very, very common. It's actually quite easy to fix as well, and XM Cyber would show you how to fix this issue. Now, this attack is only possible from the US to Asia Pacific here if the network would allow this. So XM Cyber actually does a test from A to B. So we actually do a SYN-ACK from A to B on port 135 in this occasion to show that the network would allow this attack to work, but we're not sending the attack. So there's no risk to your environment. We're just proving that all the pieces of the puzzle are there. Now, the next step is a vulnerability. This is not just detecting that a system has a vulnerability, but actually that it can be exploited. And that is a much, different outcome to vulnerability management. So in this case, this system has Bluekeep, but it could be, any of the major vulnerabilities. This is updated on a continuous basis. In this case, this is a Bluekeep vulnerability. So we're running RDP. The system has a vulnerable version. The service is running. There is a port tied to it. And from where our attacker is right now to where the system is, that port is open as well, which means that this is an exploitable vulnerability in your environment. Any one of those 5 things is not true. This is not an exploitable vulnerability. You should not prioritize that. But in this case, it is. And then it's a software misconfiguration that actually leads to the compromise of this. So this is the idea, showing the attack paths. But as we talked about, we need to think about attack graphs. The attacker has lots of opportunity to move in lots of different ways, take advantage of different exposures. But in this case, each time we're successful, we're going through this device here. This is that concept of the choke point. If we fix that with the with priority, then we're actually going to reduce the largest amount of risk with the least amount of effort. Now, there's lots of different simulations that would run on a continuous basis. And when you get all that information, we then show you in the remediation section the things that you should prioritize, how to fix them. We can show you that via those choke points. So actually a list of choke points. We can say, okay, what are the worst devices or Active Directory accounts or cloud issues, whatever it might be. I've done a filter here just to look at devices, for example, but I can look at it from from any perspective, or I can look at it from the top attack techniques. What are the methods that the attacker is taking? In this case, Log4j is the largest success for the attacker. Why is it the largest success? Because there's 83 systems that are exploitable. Now, in your environment, you might have hundreds, maybe even thousands of instances of vulnerable Log4j instances. But what we're saying is, let's push back the 1,000. 83 are exploitable. These are the ones that should have a focus. But we can do even better than that because only 2 of them are choke points. So let's give that infrastructure team just those 2 to fix as a priority. It's the least amount of effort, largest reward, and a demonstrable way of reducing the risk. We go into all the details. We give you all the technical information about, what the problem is, the MITRE attack, and all of those kind of technical details. We'll also give you different ways to fix the issue as well, and give you information that allows you to fix that. And again, from the CTEM perspective, making this an operational process, can integrate with tools like ServiceNow and Jira, for example, to be able to operationalize this process. So now we've understood that idea. This is really what our customers are getting, right? So this is actually taken from a customer environment. They started off with quite a number of risks, and you can see here, from my demo, they had a lot of things in red, a lot of stuff that could be attacked, including a large amount of vulnerabilities. Now, in their environment, actually, it was a number of instances of the print nightmare vulnerability that could be attacked. So what was interesting was that, one, they weren't finding that with their existing scanner, because scanners don't have the attacker's context of how to exploit print nightmare. And the second one is the exploitability. Actually, that could be attacked. And when they cleaned up those few instances of print nightmare on those choke points, had a dramatic increase in their score. As you can see on the right-hand side, lots of systems that were actually now turned from red to blue, which means the attacker could still find them, but there was no way to compromise them. Again, this was taken from our state of exposure management report, something that you can download. This was taken from all of our customers when they first started on our journey. And you can see that actually it was just 2% of exposures that were choke points that actually led to the largest amount of risk. And so our customers are able to make that efficiency. Looking at your environment from this perspective gives us the ability to accomplish wider strategic goals. What are some of those things that XM Cyber customers are doing? So we've looked at vulnerability prioritization, zero-day vulnerabilities. but also ransomware readiness. What are the opportunities the attacker can take from a ransomware perspective? Many organizations, ransomware is an itemized, element that is being reported into the board. We can help you understand what your level of risk is. We have a lot of manufacturing clients as well, organizations that use OT in their process. We need to understand what is the opportunity for the attacker to move from the IT to the OT environment. Can we drive away risk by understanding attack paths through the OT process? We can also help from a business perspective, on the digital transformation as organizations are moving more and more into the cloud, understand the attack paths that might be from on-prem to cloud, all those ones that are in the cloud, and make those changes, those really impactful changes. Report risk back to the board. Actually a fact-based approach to risk is something that one of our CISOs talks about, actually having true understanding. And by looking at the attack paths, we can start to look at things from supply chain as well. And again, another top issue, where are the entry points that your supply chain has into your network? Do you give your supply chain access to certain systems or Active Directory accounts or cloud? What is the onward attack paths from those locations? And again, that can help with things like mergers and acquisitions as well. So my kind of final piece really, before I hand back to Richard, is really that, now that we understand the whole organization, where are all the exposures, how are they connected together, between, the different systems and the different accounts, the different clouds, we've got a much better understanding. We can bring the security teams and IT teams much closer together. We can reduce risk with the least amount of effort. And we can provide, true remediation guidance to actually say, here are the things you need to focus on, and this is how you're going to fix these issues as well. So thank you for your time from my side. I'm going to hand back now to Richard. Thanks for giving me that time there, Richard. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you for the impeccable timekeeping.
I was surprised myself, actually, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and thank you for the demo. I just I know I bullied you into doing the demo, but I think it was very much worthwhile. And so I'm going to just really summarize and wrap up. But actually, before I just jump into that, some of the notes that I made as we went through, particularly Matt's demo, really just to emphasize, what is one of the key principles of CTEM, and actually, it is to reduce risk. Is obviously the outcome, but really is to reduce the effort that we need to put in, and as Matt was saying, pushing onto the IT teams to actually make it achievable. And actually what we talked through there with Matt in that demonstration is actually how, yes, there's vulnerabilities in the environment, but we have a platform there that can allow us to understand which ones do we actually need to remediate and which ones can we safely ignore or put on the back burner or deprioritize. So really it's about how do we deliver as much as possible for the minimum viable effort overall, which I think XM Cyber really gives us a leg up and accelerates our ability to do that, for us, for our customers, but also for any organizations that are making use of XM Cyber. CTEM is not something that is it's a framework, it's an approach, it's a model to use, so it's not a product. But as we kind of walk through there, XM Cyber is probably as close to a product that's delivering the majority of the CTEM categories to enable you to discover, prioritize, validate, and importantly, be able to mobilize or make a mobilization to remediate vulnerabilities actually achievable, which is the key approach. So really, just to summarize the webinar and what we've talked through today, before we get on to the Q&A. We've just highlighted that exposure goes well beyond and far beyond vulnerabilities and CVEs. We just look at how we've adjusting for the change in the expanding attack surface to make sure that we have coverage for our cloud environments, for our security posture, for our DevOps processes and approaches, to make sure we have a completely holistic view of our vulnerabilities, and be able to have a system and an approach in place that, if we've seen that massive growth driven by additional vulnerabilities growing, but also the points of exposure that we have in our environment. We need to make sure that we have an approach that at a bare minimum is risk-based, so we can understand the risk to our business. So having the business impact analysis, which is part of that scoping exercise that we need to do up front to understand how critical items are or assets are to us. And those assets could be VMs, they could be serverless workloads, they could be identities, access tokens, and beyond. So take a very holistic view at that, and making sure we have a risk-based approach that is prioritizing at a bare minimum, but then have planning how we're going to evolve that into being more of a continuous and validating approach that Matt walked through there, that means that we can actively manage exposure. And just to wrap up on the XM side, how can XM accelerate that approach? We walked through it there, but identifying exposures well beyond CVEs, covering your Active Directory, your cloud, credentials, software, and OS misconfigurations, to name but a few, provides or prove the exploitability of exposures, which is really important, because if they can't be exploited, they're not. We're not validating that exposure is exploitable, then we don't need to be as concerned, and we don't need to scramble the troops and exhaust our efforts and create that friction with the IT team to try and cover those. And also and that really drives that remediation efficiency, which is the main goal there overall. So I hope that was helpful, and what we've walked through there in terms of that introduction and how can we master CTEM from an overall approach, but also how can we use XM Cyber to cover that. So we'll just move through into the Q&A, and I see that we've got some questions that have come in already. If I can just open these up.
You want me to tackle?
Yeah, John, first question there. We had to investigate a lot of false positives with our current scanner when Log4j came out. How does this prove the exploitability of this? And Matt, I'll probably let you answer that, but something we saw across a lot of customers. Our IR team has run into this as well, in terms of being able to understand where Log4j actually exists or not, and where they need to react to it. So Matt, I think this is probably an XM question of based on what you've demonstrated there and the platform, how can that really help prove the exploitability?
Yeah, perfect. Actually, I'll quickly share my screen if that's okay. I can jump back into the demo to highlight. That's a really good question, and certainly one that a lot of organisations struggle with at the time and have similar issues as well. Richard, I don't know if you can unshare your screen just for a second.
Yeah.
Perfect. So this was the example that we looked at before, Log4j, and in this case, again, we have a lot of different conditions that need to be checked and validated. And this is really where vulnerability scanners were struggling, because vulnerability scanners were just looking at the presence of certain files, but not really that they were actually listening on certain ports or not. So many of our customers were using the traditional vulnerability scanners. And we're then going down, rabbit holes, finding out actually that the backup files or these jar files were on backup servers. They weren't running applications. So XM Cyber is checking all of these conditions to understand, do all of these things exist? And if these things exist, then that makes that a vulnerable version of Log4j. Again, we'll be checking all the different ports. So this is the jar file that's tied to the Log4j instance, and this is the port that it's listening on. And our attacker is being able to enumerate and communicate with this port. Therefore, we know that this is an attackable instance of Log4j. And this, dramatically reduced the effort of different teams to focus on those things. I'm going to hand back to you, Rich.
Yeah, I'll just reshare my screen very quickly. And just actually a very interesting question here, which touches upon some of the pieces I was talking about in terms of business impact analysis needing to go hand in hand. But the question here is, how can a tool help with defining risk levels without having the knowledge of the individual risk appetite in each organization? risk impact is usually a business decision on org level rather than vendors driving this. I'd be interested to hear how this tool approaches that.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's two things there, actually. Attackers don't have that same knowledge either. So they're looking at the kind of key systems in the environment that allow them to reach their goals. So we automatically understand what those common systems are. We know what a domain controller is. Our sensor is able to understand that that is a key system in any organization. We know that systems running database functions are key to the organization. So just automatically, XM Cyber can help you from the attacker's perspective focus on reducing risk away from those key critical systems. There are other organizations we work with where they have gone through some of that defined process. So they've actually said, okay, not only am I going to leverage XM Cyber's understanding of risk in my business, but also that some of those different subsidiaries or whatever have also gone through their applications and said these are key to us. Our ERP system is key for our whole organization. If that was compromised, our business falls on its feet. Manufacturers might have key systems that are tied to the OT process, and they know that if those systems are compromised, then they can't produce any, cars or whatever it might be. And then they add that information on. That's almost like a stage 2 for many organizations.
Yeah, I suppose that's part of the taking a CTEM approach is not entirely something that's in a platform. It's a program and needs to factor in that business impact analysis so that it can be clashed with the things that XM can provide, which is actually what would the impact, what is the exploitability, to help us prioritize from a technical standpoint or from a exploitability standpoint. But then we also need to make sure that we follow that through into clashing that with what's important to the business. And some of that is down to the scoping of what we need to do. So it needs to be pulled right in. So another question we have here is, how is your tool able to prioritize on a client-to-client basis without having to have a human review and eliminate false positives? A lot of vendors claim to do this, yet there's always a high volume of false positives to be remediated by DevOps engineers. So I guess we look at it there as how do we reduce that human need to evaluate everything that the tool is providing and reduce false positives.
Yeah, I think false positives comes typically from other tools that aren't proving the exploitability. And I think I'd probably say that's the best way I would answer that, is because we're checking every condition that shows, can that next system be attacked or not? Do all of those conditions exist? Does the network layer open? If you're in the cloud, does the attacker have a privilege on a Azure principal that allows them to then read-write Azure blob storage, for example? We're checking that all of those conditions exist. Not just kind of giving you this big list of problems, but actually saying, here are the ones that from the attacker's perspective allow them to reach their goal. And so that does two things. That eliminates false positives because we're checking every condition that's required. And at the same time, it's doing the prioritization because then we're showing those real paths that exist as well.
Yeah, so that key point around validation, why are we validating it? A, is it a problem? And B, how big of a problem, how exploitable it is. So just a quick time check. So I appreciate we're over. I'll just try to squeeze one last question in here. Can you name the biggest advantage that your tool has over other tools that are available in the market and provide the same functionality? So Matt, I'll let you entirely answer that.
I'm going to answer it first with a marketing answer. There are no other tools. But actually, it's quite interesting. The concept of attack path has been around for a long time. Microsoft, talks quite heavily about attack path. There's tools out there like if many of you sort of have a red teaming background, you may have used tools like Bloodhound, looking at sort of Active Directory from an attack path perspective. Then there's a couple of differentiations here. One is we're giving you complete end-to-end visibility of attack paths. So, there's a tool that will do some AD attack paths. There's a tool that might do a little bit of cloud. There's nothing that's actually giving you the full understanding the joint, the connectivity between all of those areas, because that's what the attacker's doing. So we differentiate by giving you the full attack path from on-prem to cloud and back again as well, going through AD and all of those other things as well. And I think also the prioritization, that concept of choke points. Again, there's tools out there that can give you an understanding of, some attack paths maybe, but they're not looking at those quick wins. So they're still going to give you that big list, although that list is maybe smaller because it's proving exploitability, but it's not looking at choke points. It's not actually saying, okay, here are the 1 or 2 places that you need to go and fix those things. And then showing you how to do that as well, the step-by-step guidance on how to fix those things. I would say that's probably 2 of the biggest differentiators. There's lots of other sort of smaller technical ones, etc. But I would say proving exploitability, covering the full attack path, not just in siloed parts of security, and the prioritization, the choke points, and giving you the step-by-step way of fixing those are all kind of ways that our customers are leveraging XM Cyber.
Brilliant, man. That probably is a nice segue into the wrap up, really, just to say, if you want to have a look at these differentiators and the ability in more detail, then want a full demo, Matt gave a very sneak peek into some of the capabilities, but if you want a full demo, then our team will share a demo request link after the webinar, and then you can engage to get Matt personally one-on-one to give you the full demo. So with that, I would like to thank my colleague our partner on this, XM Cyber, and Matt Quinn, who did an excellent job of talking us through XM's capability and how we can help address and accelerate the CTEM program for organizations. There was about 4 or 5 questions that we didn't get to just in the time, but we'll answer those and send them out afterwards. So that just leaves me to thank you all for your attendance, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar and found it beneficial. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.